My dad cried at my wedding. Stood at the altar. Tears running down his face. Every person in that room thought, what a loving father. I was the only one who knew the truth. 3 days before my wedding, I found a box under his bed. Inside that box was a life he had hidden from me for 23 years. Letters. Photos. A name I had never heard. I stood in his bedroom holding that box and my hands would not stop shaking. He walked in. Saw me. Said nothing. Just looked at me the way he always did when he got caught in a small lie. Like which restaurant he'd been to or why he came home late. Except this wasn't small. This changed everything I thought I knew about my childhood. About my mother. About myself. I put the box down. Walked out. Stood in the garden for 2 hours. And I kept thinking about every single thing he had ever told me. Every story. Every promise. Every time he looked me straight in the eye. Which ones were real? Because by the time I found that box, I had already caught him lying to me 11 times. 11 times I let it go. 11 times I told myself he's my dad. He loves me. He wouldn't. Stay with me. Because this story doesn't start at the wedding. Starts when I was 7 years old. And my dad looked at me and told me the most beautiful lie I had ever heard. And I believed every single word. What if the man you trusted most in the world was performing the entire time? I was 7 when I first saw my dad lie. Not to me. To someone else. We were standing in the supermarket checkout line. The cashier asked if he had a loyalty card. He said no. He had 3. I watched him slide his card into his pocket while she scanned our groceries. He caught me staring. Winked at me. Like it was our little secret. Thought it was funny. I had no idea that Wink would follow me for the next 20 years. My dad was the kind of man every kid on our street wanted. Showed up to every school play. Packed lunches with little notes inside. Knew every one of my friends' names, their parents' names, their birthdays. He was present in a way that felt almost deliberate. Every Saturday morning he made pancakes. Same playlist. Same apron. Same joke about burning the first one on purpose. I used to brag about him at school. My friends would roll their eyes and I loved it. But here is what I didn't know at 7. Or 10. Or even 15. Performance looks identical to love. Until something cracks. The first crack came on a Tuesday. I was 9. I came home from school early. Stomach bug. Let myself in with the spare key. The house was quiet. I called out for him. He wasn't supposed to be home. He worked Tuesdays. But his car was in the driveway. I walked through the kitchen. Poured myself a glass of water. Heard his voice upstairs. Low, fast, the way people talk when they don't want to be heard. I climbed 3 stairs. Stopped. He was on the phone. Door half open. I heard him say she doesn't know. She won't find out. Just give me until Friday. Then silence. Then I love you too. I walked back down every single stair. Sat at the kitchen table. Drank my water. When he came downstairs 20 minutes later, he looked surprised to see me. Asked how I got home. I said I walked. He made me soup. We watched television together for 2 hours and he never mentioned the phone call and neither did I. I was 9 years old and I already knew. Some things in this house you don't ask about. That night I lay in bed and tried to think of who he could have been talking to. I made a list in my head of every reasonable explanation. Work. A friend. A relative. I chose the one that hurt least and I went to sleep. That is what daughters of charming fathers learn early. You choose the version of the story that lets you keep loving them. And my dad was so easy to love. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He never screamed. Never stormed out. Never made you feel stupid for trusting him. He just smiled. And explained. And somehow whatever you saw with your own eyes became less important than whatever he said next. By the time I was 12 I had filed away at least 6 moments exactly like that Tuesday. 6 moments I had smoothed over. Reclassified. Stored somewhere I didn't have to look at. Because the alternative was something I was not ready for. The alternative was that the pancakes, the school plays, the little notes in the lunchbox. All of it was the performance. And behind the performance was someone I didn't recognize. I wasn't ready to meet him yet. But he was already there. He had always been there. And in 3 years he was going to show me exactly who he was. I was 12 when our dog stopped coming home. His name was Biscuit. Golden. Loud. Slept at the foot of my bed every single night for 6 years. One morning he was gone. I searched the garden. The street. The neighbor's yard. My dad sat me down at the kitchen table that evening. Hands folded. Calm voice. He said Biscuit had been taken to a special farm. Wide open fields. Other dogs to run with. Happy. Free. I asked why we couldn't visit. He said it was too far. I asked who took him. He said a very kind man who loved dogs. I nodded. Went upstairs. Cried for 20 minutes. Came back down for dinner. That was it. I believed him completely. Completely. 3 years later, I overheard my mum on the phone telling her sister that the vet had come to the house while I was at school. I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen door. Just stood there. Biscuit had been sick for months apparently. Quietly. The way things in our house always happened. Quietly behind closed doors while I was somewhere else being protected from the truth. I never said anything to my dad about it. But something shifted that day. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a small clean click inside my chest. Like a door closing. Because it wasn't really about Biscuit. It was about the fact that he looked me in the eye and built me a whole farm. Green fields. Sunshine. Other dogs. He constructed an entire world so I wouldn't have to feel pain for one single evening. And it worked. That was the terrifying part. It worked perfectly. I started replaying other things after that. The time he told me my school play was the best one he had ever seen. Every year. Without fail. Best one he had ever seen. The time he told me the reason we canceled our holiday was because the hotel had flooded. I found the credit card statement 3 years later at the bottom of a drawer. The hotel charge was still on it. Never refunded. The time he told me my grandmother had moved to a care home because she wanted more company. She told me herself years later that she had begged to stay. None of these were catastrophic lies. That was the thing. Each one on its own was nothing. A small kindness. A soft cushion placed between me and something hard. But when I laid them all out together, one after another, they formed a shape. And the shape was this. My dad had been deciding my entire life what I was allowed to know. Not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't cruel. He was a man who could not tolerate watching people he loved feel pain. So he removed the pain. Replaced it with something easier. Handed it to you wrapped up so neatly you thanked him for it. And you never once thought to look underneath. I had been walking around for 12 years built on stories he had chosen for me. The dog on the farm. The flooded hotel. The grandmother who wanted to leave. Small bricks. Laid one at a time. And by 15 I was living inside a house made entirely of them. The problem with a house like that is simple. You don't know it's not real until something hits the wall hard enough. Something was coming. I didn't know it yet. But my dad did. And he was already preparing the next story. The first sign was the heating. October. I was 15. The house went cold overnight and stayed cold. I asked my dad about it at breakfast. He said the boiler was being serviced. New parts coming. Sorted by the weekend. The weekend came. Still cold. I started wearing my coat inside the house. Nobody talked about it. My mum made soup more often. My dad worked later. I did my homework under a blanket and didn't ask again. 3 weeks later the heating came back on. My dad said the parts had finally arrived. I believed him. I was 15 and cold and I just believed him. What I didn't know was that the heating had been cut off. Not broken. Not waiting on parts. Cut off. I found out 4 years later when my mum let something slip during an argument that had nothing to do with heating or money or any of it. She said, "Do you remember that winter we couldn't pay the bills?" Just like that. Casually. Like I already knew. I sat very still. Asked her to say that again. She realized immediately. Looked away. Changed the subject. But it was already out. I drove to my dad's that evening. Didn't call ahead. Just knocked. He answered in his apron. Something on the stove. Smiled when he saw me. I asked him straight, "Were we ever in financial trouble when I was growing up?" He turned back to the stove. Stirred whatever was in the pot. Said we had tough patches. Everyone does. Nothing you needed to worry about. I asked him about the heating. Long pause. He said, "I didn't want you stressed about things a 15-year-old shouldn't be stressed about." I stood in his kitchen and counted backwards in my head. The heating was the first thing I could name. But once I started pulling that thread, everything else came with it. The holiday we canceled when I was 13. Not a flooded hotel. The new school uniform my mum bought me from a woman down the road, not the school shop. I thought it was just convenient. The birthday party I had at home instead of the bowling alley. My dad said it would be more fun. More personal. I had told everyone at school it was because he wanted it to feel special. I repeated his lie without even knowing it was one. That was the part that sat in my stomach like a stone. He hadn't just lied to me. He had handed me the lie and I had carried it out into the world like it was mine. My whole teenage understanding of our family, stable, comfortable, fine, had been stage managed. Every cold morning in that house. Every time I asked for something and he said maybe next month. Every time my mom went quiet when money came up in conversation. All of it reframed, repackaged, delivered back to me as normal. And the most unsettling part wasn't the money. It was the precision. He never slipped. Never contradicted himself. Never let the structure wobble. For years. Which meant it wasn't reactive. It wasn't him panicking in the moment and covering his tracks. It was managed. Deliberate. Consistent. He had built a version of our life and maintained it the way you maintain a house. Quietly. Regularly. Before anything had the chance to show. I drove home that night and sat in my car outside my flat. And I thought about every conversation we'd ever had about money. About the future. About what was possible. And I asked myself one question. Which parts were real? I didn't have an answer. But I was starting to understand that finding one was going to cost me something. Something I wasn't sure I could afford to lose. My dad had a war story. Not a real war. He was never in the military. But every family has that one story. The one that gets told at dinner tables and Christmas gatherings and introduced to new people within the first 20 minutes. His was about a fire. He was 19. Working a night shift at a factory. A machine overheated. The whole east wing went up fast. According to my dad, he pulled 2 men out. Carried them. One under each arm. Through smoke so thick he couldn't see his own hands. Got them both out before the fire brigade arrived. One of the men sent him a letter afterwards. Thanked him. Said he wouldn't have made it. My dad kept that letter in his desk drawer. I read it once when I was 10. Yellowed paper. Shaky handwriting. It said exactly what he always said it said. I told that story at school. Told it at sleepovers. Told it to every boyfriend I ever brought home. My dad pulled 2 men from a burning building with his bare hands. Made me feel safe. Like I came from something solid. Like whatever happened, I had a father who ran toward fire. I was 22 when it started to unravel. My dad's oldest friend, a man called Derek, came to visit from up north. They hadn't seen each other in years. I made dinner. We sat around the table. My dad was in good form. Loud, funny, the version of himself he performed for an audience. Somewhere between the main course and dessert my dad started telling the fire story. I watched Derek's face. Derek smiled. Nodded. Said nothing wrong. But his eyes did something strange. Just for a second. Just a flicker. The way eyes move when someone is deciding whether to speak. He didn't speak. Dinner finished. My dad fell asleep in the armchair. Derek and I washed up together. I handed him a plate and said, "You were there that night, weren't you? At the factory." He dried the plate slowly. Said, "Your dad's told that story a long time." I waited. He put the plate down. Said there was a fire. "That part's true. And your dad did raise the alarm. Ran and got help. That matters. That's real." I kept washing. Asked him about the 2 men. Derek picked up another plate. Said the fire brigade got them out. Your dad was outside by then. He'd gone for help. The tap was still running. I turned it off. Stood there with wet hands. Derek said he was 19. He did the right thing going for help. Somewhere along the way the story just grew. I dried my hands on the tea towel. Walked to the doorway. Looked at my dad asleep in the armchair. Mouth slightly open. Chest rising and falling. He looked so ordinary. That was the thing that hit me hardest. Not anger, not shock. Just how ordinary he looked. This man I had built into something fireproof. Something I measured myself against my whole life. Am I brave enough? Am I strong enough? My dad carried 2 men through smoke. I had been reaching toward a version of him that never existed. Calibrating myself against a fiction. And every time I told that story to someone new, I had handed them the fiction too. Made them believe it. Made them admire him for something he never did. I went back to the sink. Finished the dishes. Derek didn't say anything else. Neither did I. But driving home that night I kept thinking about the letter. The yellowed paper. The shaky handwriting. It was real. I held it. I read it. which meant somewhere there was a man who wrote it. And I had no idea anymore what he was actually thanking my dad for. How many nights did you sleep soundly because your dad smiled and said everything was okay, while the ground beneath your family was already cracking? My parents never fought in front of me. Not once. Not a raised voice. Not a slammed door. Not a single cold silence at the dinner table that I could point to and say, there. That was the moment. I used to think that was love. I was 23 when my mum moved into my spare room with 2 suitcases and a bin bag full of shoes. She arrived on a Wednesday evening. I opened the door and she looked like she hadn't slept in 4 days. I asked her what happened. She said, "I'll explain when I'm ready." She wasn't ready for 11 days. I called my dad the morning after she arrived. He picked up on the second ring. Voice completely steady. Said, "Your mum and I are going through a rough patch. It'll sort itself out. Don't worry." I asked how long it had been rough. Pause. He said not long. I found out later it had been 7 years. 7 years of a marriage held together with nothing but routine and performance, and my dad's extraordinary ability to look at his daughter and say, "We're fine." 7 years of separate lives running parallel inside the same house. Same dinner table. Same Sunday routine. Same Christmas card with both their names signed at the bottom. I had visited that house every single month for 7 years. Sat at that dinner table. Watched them move around each other in that kitchen. Thought they're solid. Whatever else is uncertain in my life, they are solid. My mum finally talked on a Sunday morning. We sat on my kitchen floor with coffee because neither of us wanted to be at a table for that conversation. She talked for 2 hours. I didn't say much. Somewhere in the middle of it she said, "I think he genuinely believed that as long as you didn't know it wasn't real." I turned that over in my head. As long as you didn't know it wasn't real. I thought about every visit. Every phone call. Every time I called him stressed about work or money or relationships, and he listened and gave advice and never once let his voice carry anything of his own. He had been managing a collapsing marriage with one hand and holding me steady with the other. And I had no idea. I had taken his steadiness and mistaken it for truth. That was the part one couldn't shake. Not the separation. Not even the 7 years. It was the phone calls. Because there were moments, late nights, long drives, when I had said to him, "Dad, I feel like everything is falling apart." And he had said, "It's not. You're okay. We're all okay. Calm. Certain. Unshakable." And I had exhaled. Believed him. Slept. While his own life was doing exactly what I was afraid mine was doing. He knew what falling apart felt like from the inside. And he looked me in the eye and told me it wasn't happening. Not to me. Not to him. Not to any of us. I went to see him 2 weeks after my mum arrived with her suitcases. He opened the door. The house was tidy. Dinner on. Same apron. I sat down at the kitchen table. He put a cup of tea in front of me. I looked at him and said, "How long did you know it was over?" He sat down. Wrapped both hands around his mug. Said, "I didn't want it to be." I waited. He said, "And I didn't want it to be your problem." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside a car drove past. I picked up my tea. And for the first time in my life I looked at my father and saw someone who was just as frightened as I was. He had just had 23 more years of practice hiding it. What if your dad didn't just keep secrets? What if he had built an entire existence you were never supposed to find? I found the phone by accident. Not his regular phone. The second one. Small. Old model. Tucked inside a zipped compartment in a gym bag at the back of his wardrobe. I wasn't snooping. He had asked me to grab his gym bag while he was in the shower. Said his back was playing up and he needed the heat pack inside. I unzipped the wrong compartment. Saw it immediately. Picked it up. Put it back. Zipped the compartment. Grabbed the heat pack from the other side. Walked downstairs. Handed it to him. Sat on the sofa. Said nothing. We watched television for an hour. He made us both tea. I drove home with both hands tight on the wheel the entire way. That was a Thursday. I spent Friday convincing myself it meant nothing. Old phone. Spare. But perfectly reasonable. Perfectly explainable. By Saturday morning I had run out of reasonable explanations. I called my mum. Not to tell her. Just to hear her voice. He talked about her garden. A new plant she'd put in. The neighbor's cat. I listened and said the right things and hung up. Then I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. There are moments where you are standing at the exact edge of knowing something. And you understand clearly, once you step forward you cannot step back. I had been standing at that edge my entire life with my father. Always choosing to step back. Always finding the softer version of what I had just seen. I drove to his house on Sunday morning unannounced. He was surprised. Happy to see me. Put the kettle on immediately. I sat at the kitchen table. Waited until he sat down across from me. Then I said, "Dad, the gym bag." He went completely still. Not the kind of still where someone is thinking. The kind of still where someone already knows exactly what you mean. 3 seconds passed. He picked up his mug. Put it down without drinking. Said, "How long have you known?" I said, 3 days. He nodded slowly. Looked at the table. And then he started talking. Her name was Carol. They had met 6 years ago. A work conference. Started slowly, his words slowly, and then it didn't stop. He said it was never supposed to become what it became. I watched his mouth moving and heard the words and felt absolutely nothing. Just a strange, flat clarity. Like the moment after a very loud noise when everything goes quiet. He talked for 20 minutes. I didn't ask questions. At the end he looked up at me and said, "I never wanted you to be part of this." Said, "But I am." He had no answer for that. I looked around the kitchen. Same table. Same mugs. Same apron hanging on the same hook by the door. I had sat in this kitchen my entire life. Done homework here. Cried here. Laughed here. Built every significant memory of safety I owned inside these 4 walls. And the whole time, a second phone. Second name. A second life running quietly in the background like a program he forgot to close. I stood up. He stood up too. Said, "Are you okay?" I picked up my bag. Said, "I don't know yet." Walked to the door. He followed me to the hallway. Said my name once quietly the way he used to when I was small and upset about something. I opened the front door. The street outside was completely normal. A man walking a dog. 2 kids on bikes. Someone reversing out of a driveway. Everything exactly as it had always been. I walked to my car. Got in. Sat there for a moment. And I thought about the very first thing I ever noticed about my dad. How present he was. How completely, entirely, attentively present. Eyes on you. Full attention. Like nothing else in the world existed. I understood it now. That kind of presence doesn't come from having nothing to hide. Comes from being very, very good at hiding it. What if the most damaging thing your dad ever said to you wasn't a cruel word, but a quiet, confident verdict he delivered like it was fact? I was 17 when my dad told me I wasn't a writer. Not cruelly. Not dismissively. Carefully. Thoughtfully. The way he did everything. I had spent 3 months writing a short story. Entered it into a national competition. Told almost nobody. Told him. He read it at the kitchen table one Sunday morning. I watched him from across the room pretending to make toast. He finished. Folded the pages. Placed them flat on the table. It's good. You have a real imagination. I waited. He said, "I just don't think writing is where your strength is. You're logical. Analytical. You should lean into that." Then he picked up his newspaper. Conversation over. I took the pages off the table. Went upstairs. Didn't enter the competition. Didn't write another story for 4 years. I told myself it was his honesty. That's what I called it for a long time, his honesty. His ability to see me clearly and tell me the truth when others wouldn't. I leaned into logical. Into analytical. Chose a degree he approved of. A career path he described as sensible. Every decision filtered through that Sunday morning at the kitchen table. I wasn't a writer. My dad had read my work and he knew. I was 26 when a colleague forwarded me an email. A piece I had written for an internal company report had been shared outside the organization. Someone wanted to know who wrote it. I stared at the email for a long time. Showed it to my dad that weekend. He read it. Smiled. Said, "See, this is your strength. Clear. Structured. Professional." I asked him if he remembered the short story. He said, "Of course." I asked him what was wrong with it. He put the email down. Said, "Nothing was wrong with it." I went very still. He said, "I just didn't want you chasing something uncertain. Writing felt risky. I wanted you stable." The room was quiet. I said, "So you told me I wasn't good enough to protect me from the risk." He didn't answer. Which was its own answer. I drove home and pulled out a box from the top of my wardrobe. Inside was every piece of writing I had abandoned in my 20s. Half-finished things. Opened documents never reopened. A journal I stopped keeping at 19 because I had decided I wasn't someone who wrote. My dad had looked at me at 17 and made a calculation. Decided what version of me was safest. Then handed me that version and watched me build my life around it. And I had done it willingly. Gratefully. I sat on my bedroom floor with that box and went through every single page. There was a short story at the bottom. 3 months of work. 17 years old. I read it from the beginning. All the way through. It wasn't perfect. But it was alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Something in it moved forward. Took risks. Didn't stop to ask permission. I put it down on the floor in front of me. Thought about the girl who wrote it. How certain she had been. How much she had wanted to show him. How completely one Sunday morning had flattened her. Not with cruelty. With something far more effective. A quiet, confident verdict delivered by the one person whose opinion she had built her entire sense of self around. My dad never called me stupid. Never told me I would fail. He did something more precise than that. He looked at who I was becoming and chose a safer version. Then convinced me it was my own choice. I picked up the short story. Read the last line again. Put it in my bag. And for the first time in 9 years, opened a new document. Would you want to know if your dad was dying? Or would you rather have one more year of believing everything was fine? My dad started losing weight in the autumn. I noticed at Sunday dinner. The way his shirt sat differently. The way he pushed food around his plate more than he ate it. I asked him about it. He said he'd been watching what he ate. Trying to be healthier. Doctor's orders, general stuff. Cholesterol. Blood pressure. Nothing serious. I nodded. Passed him the potatoes. He declined the potatoes. I filed it away. November came. He was slower on the stairs. Gripped the banister in a way he hadn't before. I asked again. He said he'd pulled something in his back at the gym. December. Christmas dinner. He ate almost nothing. Laughed loudly at everything. Refilled everyone else's glass before they were empty. Classic performance. Full volume. I watched him and felt something cold move through me. But he was smiling. So I smiled back. January, I got a phone call from my mum. They were separated, but she still knew things about him that I didn't. She said, "Has your dad told you about his appointments?" I said, "What appointments?" Long silence. He said, "You need to call him. Today." I called him before I even put my coat on. He picked up. Cheerful. Asked how I was before I could ask anything. Said, "Dad. What appointments?" Silence. Different from his usual silences. Order. Surrender in it. He said, "I was going to tell you." I was waiting until I had more information. I sat down on my stairs. He talked for a long time. Stomach. Caught late. Treatment started in October. Ongoing. October. I did the maths in my head. 3 months. He had been sitting across from me at dinner tables and answering my calls and asking about my life for 3 months. While chemotherapy moved through his body. While he already knew. I asked him why. He said, "I didn't want to ruin Christmas." I pressed my hand flat against the wall next to me. Said, "Christmas." He said, "And I didn't want you frightened. There was nothing you could do. I had it handled. I had it handled." I thought about December. His loud laugh. The refilled glasses. The performance cranked up to maximum while his body was doing something he couldn't control. I drove to his house that afternoon. He opened the door and looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not just physically. Just smaller. Like the effort of holding the secret had taken something structural out of him. I walked in. Sat down. Didn't hug him immediately. Couldn't yet. I asked him to tell me everything from the beginning. He did. All of it. Dates. Scans. Percentages. Treatment schedule. The kind of information he had been carrying alone for 93 days. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I looked at him across the table. This man who had hidden a dog's death to spare me one evening of grief. Who had hidden financial collapse to spare me adolescent worry. Who had sat at Christmas dinner dying by degrees and refilled every single glass. He looked back at me. Waiting. I think he expected anger. I didn't have anger. I had something much harder to carry than anger. I had the image of him alone. Sober. Sitting in a waiting room somewhere. Getting a result. Processing it. Deciding in that moment she doesn't need to know yet. Building the plan. Maintaining it. Month after month. Protecting me from the one thing I most needed to be present for. I reached across the table. Put my hand over his. Said, "You don't get to do this alone anymore." He looked down at our hands. And for the first time in my entire life, my dad did not have a single word ready. Just sat there, quiet, letting me hold on. What do you do when your dad remembers a completely different childhood than the one you actually lived? It started with a photograph. My dad was clearing out the attic, called me over to help. We sat on the floor surrounded by boxes and he held up a photo from my 8th birthday party. Said, "Look at that. I never missed one. Not a single birthday." I took the photo from him, looked at it, said nothing, because my 10th birthday he wasn't there. I remembered it with complete precision. My mom made the cake. My aunt drove me to the bowling alley. My dad called at 7 in the evening and said he was stuck at work and he was sorry. I had waited for him the entire party. Kept looking at the door. I was 10 years old and I waited for him and he didn't come. I handed the photo back. He put it in the keep pile. We kept sorting boxes. But something had started. 2 weeks later we were at my cousin's wedding. Family gathered at one table. Someone mentioned school plays. My dad said I was at every single one. My aunt looked at him sideways. Said, "You missed the one in year 6. Remember? You were away for work." My dad shook his head. Said, "No, I was there." My aunt started to say something else. I watched her decide not to. Change the subject. But I had seen her face. That was twice in 2 weeks. I started paying attention differently after that. Christmas. My dad telling my younger cousin about teaching me to ride a bike. The patience of it. The long afternoon. Up and down the street until I got it. I listened to the whole story. My uncle had taught me to ride my bike. My dad was away that weekend. I was 7. My uncle held the back of the seat and ran alongside me down our road on a Saturday morning. My dad wasn't there. I know because I wished he was. I remember the specific feeling of wishing he was. I didn't correct him at Christmas. But I went home that night and opened my old journal. The one I kept between the ages of 9 and 13. Looked up my 10th birthday. Dad didn't come. Mom said he tried. I don't think he tried. Looked up the year 6 school play. Dad missed it. Said sorry with a magazine from the airport. Looked up the bike. Uncle Pete taught me. It took all afternoon. Dad called from somewhere and said he heard I did it. Page after page. His absence written in my own 9-year-old handwriting. And now, 30 years later, he was sitting at family tables reconstructing himself into someone who had been there. Not lying aggressively. Not rewriting history with anger. Just quietly replacing the gaps with presence. Filling in the missing Saturdays with versions of himself that showed up. I drove to his house on a Tuesday. He was in the garden. Looked up. Smiled. I sat across from him at the garden table. Said, "Dad, my 10th birthday. Were you there?" He frowned. Thinking. Said, "Of course. We had that cake your mom made." I said, "You called at 7. You were stuck at work. I waited for you the whole party." He shook his head slowly. Said, "I don't think that's right." I said, "I wrote it down. That night. In my journal." He looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Something more complicated than guilt. He said, "I was there for most of it." I said, "You weren't there at all. The garden was quiet. A bird somewhere. Wind in the hedge." He looked down at the table. Said, "I tried to be there. Always tried." I looked at him. And I understood something in that moment I hadn't before. He wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself. Had been for years. Rewriting absence into effort. Gaps into presence. Building a version of fatherhood he could live inside. Because the alternative, the journals, the doors, the waiting, was something he could not afford to look at directly. I picked up my bag. Said, "I know you tried." Walked back through the house. Past the kitchen table. Past the apron on the hook. Past 30 years of a story he had been quietly editing. Got in my car. And sat with the strangest feeling. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just the weight of being the only one of us keeping the real version. What if the one lie you should have been most angry about turned out to be the only reason you're still standing? I was 19 when I tried to drop out of university. First semester. 8 weeks in. I was drowning. Couldn't keep up. Couldn't sleep. Sat in lectures and understood nothing and walked back to my room every afternoon and stared at the ceiling. I called my dad on a Wednesday night. Told him I was done. Coming home. The course was wrong. The city was wrong. Everything was wrong. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then said, "But give me until the weekend. Come home Friday. We'll talk properly." I said, there's nothing to talk about. I've decided. He said Friday. Just Friday. I went home Friday. He took me to the place we always went when something needed to be said. A pub 20 minutes outside town. Quiet. Booths in the back. We ordered food. He talked about everything except university for 40 minutes. Football. A film he'd seen. Something funny that happened at work. I waited. Finally I said, Dad, I'm leaving. He nodded. Said, I spoke to your professor. I stopped. Said, you what? He said, Dr. Whitmore. I called the department. Spoke to her Thursday morning. I felt heat move up my neck. Said, you had no right to do that. He said, she told me you submitted the best first essay in your group. I said nothing. He slid a piece of paper across the table. Printed email. Dr. Whitmore's name at the top. I didn't pick it up. He said, she said you came to her office hours once and asked questions nobody else thought to ask. She said she was planning to speak to you. I looked at the paper without touching it. He said, you're not drowning because you can't do it. You're drowning because you think you can't. I said, you went behind my back. He said, yes. No apology. No explanation. Just, yes. I was furious. Ate the rest of my meal in near silence. Drove back to his house. Slept in my old room. Went back to university Sunday morning. Didn't speak to him for 2 weeks. Finished the semester. Then the year. Then the degree. Graduated with a first. Dr. Whitmore shook my hand at the ceremony and said she always knew I would get there. My dad stood in the crowd in a terrible tie, clapping too loudly. I didn't tell him for years that the phone call changed everything. Not the content of it. Not what Dr. Whitmore said. Just the fact that he made it. That on a Thursday morning he picked up the phone and fought for a version of me I had already given up on. Without asking. Without permission. Completely out of line. I brought it up years later. Sitting in his garden one evening. Asked him what he would have done if I had still left after that Friday. He thought about it. Said, let you go. Helped you figure out what was next. I asked him why he didn't just let me go on the Wednesday phone call. He looked out at the garden. Said, because you called me. You didn't call to tell me you were leaving. You called because you wanted someone to stop you. I turned that over. He said, you always called when you wanted to be talked back. I thought about every phone call. Every late night. Every moment of doubt handed to him down a phone line. He was right. I had always called him. Even knowing what I knew. Even after the box in the wardrobe. After the heating. After Carol. After the fire story. After all of it. I still called him. And he always picked up. That was the thing about my dad that no clean story could contain. He lied about the dog. He lied about money. He built a fire story from nothing and maintained it for decades. He had a second phone and a secret and a marriage he let collapse in silence. He rewrote my childhood into something he could live with. And then, without asking, he called my professor on a Thursday morning and refused to let me disappear. Both things were entirely him. That was what I had spent years trying to reconcile. Not the lies on their own. But the fact that the lies and the love came from the exact same place. The same instinct. The same man. Looking at the people he loved and deciding, quietly, unilaterally, without permission, what they needed. Sometimes he was catastrophically wrong. That one Thursday morning he was the only person in the world who was right. What actually happens when you finally sit across from your dad and lay every single lie on the table between you? What does that room feel like? I planned it for 3 weeks. Not the words exactly. Just the decision to say them. I had spent years collecting moments. Filing them. Smoothing them over. Choosing the softer version. I was done choosing the softer version. I called him on a Monday morning. Asked if I could come for dinner Friday. He said of course. Asked if I wanted anything specific. I said no. Spent the week writing nothing down. Didn't rehearse. Didn't prepare a speech. Just decided I was going to sit across from him and say every true thing out loud. For the first time in my life. Out loud. Friday came. He made pasta. Poured wine. Talked about a documentary he'd watched. I let dinner happen. We cleared the plates. He made tea. Sat back down. And I said, I need to talk to you about some things. He looked at me over his mug. Said, just okay. Steady. Like he'd been waiting. I started with the smallest thing. The supermarket. The loyalty card. The wink. He smiled faintly. Said, you remember that? I said, I remember everything. The smile faded. Kept going. Biscuit. The farm that wasn't a farm. The vet who came while I was at school. He looked at the table. The heating. 3 weeks of cold. Telling me it was parts. It was cut off. He wrapped both hands around his mug. The fire story. Derek at the sink. What actually happened that night? He closed his eyes briefly. The second phone. 6 years. He opened his eyes. Said nothing. The marriage. 7 years. Sitting at Christmas dinner performing stability while everything had already ended. He exhaled slowly. My writing. The short story. The Sunday morning verdict that I carried for 9 years. His jaw tightened. The birthdays. The school plays. The bike. The journal with his absences written in my own handwriting. He put his mug down. The illness. 93 days alone. Not wanting to ruin Christmas. He pressed his fingers flat against the table. I stopped. The kitchen was completely silent. He sat across from me looking smaller than he had ever looked. Not defensive. Not scrambling. Just present. Fully, quietly present in a way that had no performance left in it. I waited. He said, "Is there more?" I said, "Probably. But that's enough for tonight." He nodded. Long silence. Then he said, "I don't know where to start." I said, "You don't have to start anywhere. I just needed you to hear it." He looked up. Said, "All of it is true." 3 words I had not expected him to say that cleanly. No qualifications. No context. No gentler version. Just, all of it is true. I felt something release in my chest. Something I had been holding so long I had stopped noticing its weight. He said, "I told myself every time that I was protecting you. That I know." He said, "That doesn't make it right." I said, "No, it doesn't." Another silence. He said, "I spent so long trying to make sure nothing touched you that I never stopped to ask if you wanted to be touched by it." I looked at him. He said, "You were always braver than I gave you credit for." The kitchen light was low. Outside it had gone fully dark. I thought about 17 years old at that table with my short story. Him folding the pages. Placing them flat. His careful, confident verdict. And here, same table. Same mugs. Same kitchen. Him placing everything flat again. Except this time it was his own version of himself he was putting down. I said, "Why didn't you ever just tell me the truth?" He was quiet for a long time. Said, "Because the truth meant you seeing me clearly." Pause. Said, "And I was never sure I could survive that." I looked at my dad. Really looked at him. Not the pancake dad. Not the fire story dad. Not the steady voice on the phone at midnight. Just a man. 61 years old. Sitting across from his daughter with nothing left between them. I picked up my tea. Said, "You survived it." He looked at me. Eyes red at the edges. Said nothing. But something in his face shifted. Quiet. Unguarded. Real. For the first time, completely, entirely real. 6 months after that Friday dinner something changed between us. Not dramatically. Not a single conversation that fixed everything. Just, slowly the air between us became different. He stopped performing. That was the most noticeable thing. No more maximum volume at family gatherings. No more stories told to impress. No more careful management of what I was allowed to see. He called me one Tuesday and said he was having a hard week. Just that. No explanation wrapped around it. No resolution offered at the end. Just, "I'm having a hard week." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and felt the ground shift slightly beneath me. Because in 40 years that had never happened. He had called me 1,000 times. Never once to say he was struggling. I asked him what was going on. He talked for 20 minutes. Real things. Uncertain things. Things without tidy endings. I listened. Didn't try to fix it. Didn't hand him a softer version. Just listened. When he finished he said, "Sorry. I don't know why I called." That I do. He went quiet. I said, "Same reason I always called you." He laughed. Small. Tired. Genuine. Nothing performed in it. I had spent years trying to find the right category for my dad. Good or bad. Honest or dishonest. Safe or dangerous. I wanted a verdict I could file somewhere and stop returning to. I never found one. Because he refused to fit. The man who hid a dying marriage for 7 years also drove 4 hours in one night when I called him frightened and alone at 24. The man who built a fire story from nothing also sat in a hospital corridor for 9 hours when I had my appendix out at 31. Wouldn't leave. Slept in the chair. The man who handed me a verdict on my writing at 17 also called my professor on a Thursday morning and refused to let me quit. Every version of him was real. That was what I had to learn to hold. Not choose between. Hold. The lies were real. The love was real. Both came from the same hands. My dad was not a villain with occasional warmth. He was not a hero with unfortunate flaws. He was a man who loved his daughter so completely and so badly at the same time that the two things became almost impossible to separate. A man who looked at pain, any pain, and could not leave it alone. Had to touch it, shape it, make it smaller before it reached me, even when that instinct caused the very damage he was trying to prevent. I think about the box now. The one I found under his bed 3 days before my wedding. Letters. Photos. A name I didn't know. I stood in his bedroom holding that box and my hands would not stop shaking. I know things now I didn't know then. About Carol. About the marriage. About what those years cost both my parents in ways I was never supposed to see. And I know this. He cried at my wedding. Stood at that altar with everything he had hidden and everything he had done and everything he hadn't said and still wept. Not for the performance. I know that now. Because I have seen him without the performance. Sat across from him in that kitchen with every brick of every wall he ever built lying flat on the table between us. And watched him cry then too. Same tears. Nothing constructed in them. My dad lied to me my entire life. Small lies. Large lies. Lies of omission. Lies of protection. Lies he believed. Lies he knew exactly were lies. He built farms for dead dogs. He heated a cold house with a story about parts. He carried a second phone and a second name for 6 years. He sat at Christmas dinner dying and refilled every glass. He took my short story and folded it flat and handed me a safer version of myself. He remembered a childhood that never happened and forgot the one that did. And then one Tuesday he called me with nothing to offer. No resolution. No performance. No carefully constructed version of himself. Just a hard week. An honest voice. His actual self on the end of the line. Waiting to see if I would stay. I stayed. Not because the lies didn't matter. Not because love excuses everything it touches. But because I had spent enough years looking at my father through the lens of what he hid. And I wanted to spend whatever time was left looking at him through what remained when the hiding stopped. A man. Flawed. Frightened. Trying. I still call him Dad. I always will.